And joining me now is Republican Senator Ted Cruz, joining us exclusively. And great to have you with us, Senator. You know, I know heard some of that, but I wanted to play a bit more for you about what Hillary Clinton said about an issue you've talked a lot about. That, of course, is Benghazi.
There have been, as you know, a number of investigations, including the independent one that the State Department commissioned, as well as many in Congress. There are answers, not all of them, not enough, frankly. I'm still looking for answers because it was a confusing and difficult time.
It sounds like you and the Secretary agree that you are both still looking for answers.
Well, I was certainly encouraged when she said that, and I hope that that means Secretary Clinton will support the resolution that I filed in the U.S. Senate, along with 24 other senators, to have a joint select committee to investigate what happened in Benghazi. The House has created a select committee. I've asked the Senate to do so. And indeed, just a few weeks ago when I stood on the Senate floor and asked for unanimous consent for the Senate to do our job to answer the questions that Secretary Clinton rightly noted are still there, Bob Menendez, the senator who's the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, stood up and objected. And you know, Erin, his response was striking. In the course of objecting, he said, "I have no idea whether President Obama was awake or asleep the night that our Americans were under attack." And he went even further. He said, "I have no idea whether there was anything President Obama could have done to save the lives of those 4 Americans. But we don't need to answer those questions." Well, with respect, I think those questions are important to all the men and women serving in our nation, and we ought to get to the bottom of the truth.
Now, look, it is true, of course, on Benghazi that there need to be answers. People need to be held accountable, regardless of the politics around it. But the politics have taken center stage. You've been a big part of that. And as you know, Hillary Clinton recently in an ABC interview said Republican criticism, a lot of it coming from you. She didn't say that, but I'm noting for our viewers, you've been very critical of her handling of Benghazi, has actually incentivized her to run for president. I mean, do you think you're emboldening her by continuing with these investigations?
You know, Erin, the truth isn't partisan. They're basic questions that haven't been answered, and she views it as criticism. To ask what happened that night, why were we attacked by terrorists, why didn't we prevent it, why didn't we have assets in place to save those 4 Americans? And why did the administration tell the American people its story that was demonstrably false? Now, what we do know is even though Secretary Clinton today is telling CNN there are a lot of answers that need to be answered, we know that in the aftermath of Benghazi, her chief political aide, Cheryl Mills, told career Foreign Service officers, don't talk to reporters, don't talk to Congress, don't talk about what happened. And it is not partisan to simply say we should get to the truth. That should be a bipartisan objective, but unfortunately, Secretary Clinton from the beginning has stonewalled on this rather than acting as a partner getting to the bottom of what happened.
Well, I mean, you know, it's interesting. I know they were saying, look, part of the reason they didn't want to talk to reporters was they wanted understood more about what happened because they didn't want it to become politicized. They wanted to come out with an accurate part of the story. Maybe that was a poor way from public relations of handling it, but it may have made sense. I mean, if she says now, look, I still need answers, isn't that enough for you?
We don't have the answers, though. I mean, she says
But I mean, she's admitting I don't have them all. I'm not trying to say I'm blameless. I'm trying to get answers.
But she's not trying to get answers. She's trying to block the answers from ever being answered. Indeed, her most famous comment on this is, what difference does it make? She views this as purely through the lens of partisan politics. And we owe the men and women serving this nation, we owe our diplomatic corps, we owe our ambassadors. Ambassador Christopher Stevens was the first U.S. ambassador killed in the line of duty since 1979. We owe it to the men and women serving this country to get to the bottom, not to play politics with it.
How has she played politics with it, though? Her specifically,
by having her political aide instruct career Foreign Service officers, do not talk about what happened, do not answer questions from Congress or the media. And indeed, the White House, Erin, lied to the media. You'll recall the White House told the media, we did not change the talking points at all about what happened in Benghazi.
Well, there's still questions as to where those talking points got altered. As you and I both know, that's a complicated trail.
Erin, with respect, there are no questions. There are 11 edits that they've admitted now they did change. So there's no dispute that they changed it, and there's no dispute that they lied on it.
Whether it was about tone or honesty. I want to get at this point, though.
But no, it wasn't tone or honesty. What they did specifically, and there's a broader point. The edits they made is they edited out every reference to Al-Qaeda and radical Islamic terrorism. And the problem with the Obama-Clinton foreign policy. You know, throughout this town hall, Secretary Clinton said everything was a hard choice. This was a hard choice. That was a hard choice. There's a reason everything appears to be a hard choice because
yes, but let me just make this point. I know neither you or I want to have a whole interview about Benghazi, but Al-Qaeda itself is a complicated term, right? Maybe they took the words out because that would imply direction straight from Al-Qaeda headquarters on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, right? As opposed to a group who was inspired by. There were reasons to take those terms out that made complete sense.
Erin, with respect, no, they didn't, because they didn't just take out Al-Qaeda. They took out any reference to radical Islamic terrorism. And the most consistent error of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy is a failure to understand the nature of the people we're dealing with, of our enemies. It is striking that neither President Obama nor Hillary Clinton in this discussion tonight are willing to utter the words radical Islamic terrorism. They do not understand the radical religious extremism of individuals committed to jihad who have pledged to murder Americans. And that leads them to keep making the mistakes over and over and over again, whether it is releasing 5 senior Taliban terrorists without understanding that these individuals will likely return to active warfare against the United States, whether it is in the case of Iraq, not understanding the threat posed by ISIS. I'll tell you a great question we ought to be asking right now is whether the Obama administration has armed ISIS, these radical Islamic terrorists, whether they have armed them in Syria, because we know they're arming some of the rebels, and we haven't had an answer as to which rebels they're arming and which they're not. And you cannot win a battle against radical Islamic terrorism if you're unwilling to utter the words radical Islamic terrorism, if you don't acknowledge the character.
If you believe this is a central threat, as you do, you're putting it out here right now, let's talk about ISIS in Iraq, because you mentioned it. If this is such an existential threat, as you believe, then that would mean, I guess, intellectually consistently, that you would then be willing to talk to Iran to work together, because the U.S. and Iran are on the same side as seeing ISIS and this radical Islamic extremism that they represent as a crucial existential issue in Iraq.
Absolutely not, and that was the most surreal moment of Secretary Clinton's entire interview, when she suggested that the United States could partner with Iran.
But I don't understand why you would rule it out. If you say this is the central issue, we're on the same side, if you're not willing to work with them, then you must not see it as a central issue.
No, that's not true. ISIS are radical Islamic terrorists who have declared their intention to murder Americans, Israelis, to attack Jordan. They are enemies. But the regime in Iran is an enemy as well. They refer to Israel as the little Satan and America as the great Satan. And this goes back, what was astonishing is on a 20, 30-minute discussion of foreign policy, Secretary Clinton did not once mention the gravest national security threat in the world to the United States, which is the threat of the nation of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons capability. That's a stunning omission. So the idea...
And that is a fair question, the Iranian nuclear issue. But I want to just understand, you're saying that even though Iran and the U.S. may agree on ISIS, and ISIS is such a huge threat, that is still not enough for you to at least have a conversation with Iran. Like, for example, not just Hillary Clinton, Lindsey Graham said that he would do.
Under no circumstances should we be partnering with Iran. Listen, I agree with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that the current deal that the Obama administration is negotiating with Iran is a very, very bad deal. It is an historic mistake. And the reason they're making the mistake, the person leading the negotiations is a negotiator named Wendy Sherman. She is an old Clinton hand. She was the lead negotiator for the Clinton administration with North Korea, and we're making the same mistakes we made in the 1990s. In the 1990s, in the Clinton administration, they relaxed sanctions against North Korea. Billions of dollars flowed in, and North Korea used those billions of dollars to develop nuclear weapons. We literally brought the same negotiator back who had failed in the prior deal to negotiate the same lousy deal. And now with what's happening in Iraq, the danger is, I think, even greater. That we'll see an extension of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy to cut a deal with Iran that only accelerates their progress towards nuclear weapons capability.
I will note, I'm not saying you're defending George Bush at all, but for those out there, of course, George Bush also contributed to relaxing some of those sanctions against the North Korean regime. But I want to talk to you, if I could, before we go, briefly about domestic policy as well.
Sure.
You are seen as the leader of the Tea Party, no question about that. There's a big division in the GOP right now. Peter Senator King was on this show last week, and I asked him about you because he was talking about how you and Rand Paul were rising in power, how that frustrated him, and here's how he responded.
Well, first of all, by showing that Ted Cruz, for instance, is a fraud. Last year, he induced the Congress to shut down the government, and after they did it, he couldn't deliver at all. Basically, he said if the House shut down the government, that he would be able to deliver in the Senate the ending of Obamacare.
He is correct. You did not deliver that. What do you say when he calls you a fraud?
You know, Erin, I don't know Mr. King. I've never met him. To be honest, I don't think I had ever heard of him until he started getting on television attacking me. He's welcome to express his opinions, and he is entitled to them. You know, I think there are far too many politicians in Washington in both parties that spend their time attacking each other rather than focusing on the substance. I'll tell you what the substance is that matters to the 26 million Texans I represent and to Americans all across this country, is that we're trapped in a great stagnation. We have the lowest labor force participation since 1978. Millions of Americans are hurting. And you know the people who are hurting the most under the Obama economy? They're young people, they're Hispanics, they're African Americans, they're single moms. It was striking in the whole course of Secretary Clinton's interview. She didn't talk at all that I could see about the economy, about people who've lost their jobs, about Obamacare.
To be fair, she wasn't really asked about that. So I think, I mean, that's important to say that. You're right, didn't really come up, but she wasn't asked. But let me ask you about, I want to ask you about you, though. You have spawned a whole group of people that people say, this is the next Ted Cruz. This is the next Ted Cruz. Some of those people are being flattering of you. Some of them are saying that in a very derogatory way. But some are frustrated, including highly respected members of your own party. You know who I'm talking about. They say you're hurting the party. You're hurting the country. Here's Lindsey Graham, who, as you know, just won his primary against a Tea Party challenger, talking about you during the shutdown.
Well, I think the tactical choice that he embraced hurt our party. We helped President Obama when he needed our help the most. After this debacle called the shutdown, our party's been hurt. Our brand name is at its lowest ever. Obamacare actually got a bump in polling, and we got in the way of a disastrous rollout.
He is not alone in blaming you for that. And those in your own party who say it's a tone of anger, a lack of wanting to compromise that you bring to Washington that is exactly what this country does not need.
Well, I would note, Erin, that you pulled up a clip that's nearly a year old. And indeed, the word anger comes from you.
Well, it was from last fall, right after your big moment where you became the guy everybody wanted to be the next Ted Cruz regarding the shutdown in Obamacare. It was an important moment.
Erin, I agree. It was a very important moment. And it was a moment when millions of Americans across this country stood up against the disaster that was Obamacare, the train wreck that is Obamacare. And I think as a result of so many Americans standing up, we elevated the national debate over the enormous harms. Millions of Americans have lost their jobs. Millions of Americans have lost their health care, have lost their doctors because of Obamacare. Millions of Americans have been forced into part-time work. And it's very interesting, if you want to talk about the impact on the national political discourse. Right now, Democrats in Washington are running scared because it is very likely Republicans are going to retake the U.S. Senate. We're going to retire Harry Reid as majority leader. And the reason, plain and simple, is because of Obamacare. It's an albatross around the necks of Democrats. And I would suggest to you that millions of Americans standing up last fall, highlighting the harms of Obamacare, played a very direct cause in the electoral success we're seeing. Look, there are too many politicians in Washington who worry about bickering back and forth. The biggest divide we've got in this country, it's not between Republicans and Democrats. It is between entrenched politicians in Washington, in both parties, and the American people. We've got to bring back jobs and economic growth. Stop the bickering in Washington.
All right. Well, we will see what happens with Obamacare. It is obviously inextricably tied to your own fate. Thank you very much, Senator, for your time tonight.
Thank you for having me, Erin.